Thanks for joining us today. This is the Transportation Energy Institute's webinar primer for our most recent publication that's been provided by Stillwater and Associates, and which has gone through TEI's peer review process. So we're very happy with this document. And with us today, we've got the Executive Director of TEI, Mr. John Eichberger, and Senior Associate, Stillwater Associates, Adam Schuber, who's the primary author on this document. And the report you can find on our website later on if you can go to migrate over to our website and download the whole report free of charge. So just a little bit of housekeeping here. Please feel free to enter in your questions or in the chat throughout the presentation, and I'll keep an eye on that. And we'll hold the questions to the very end if there are some, and we can cover anything you think you guys want to talk about. This is a very expansive document. And one of the things that at TEI and across industry we realize is that electrification is coming. It could be rapid. It is something that requires a lot of infrastructure. It is something that requires a lot of revamping by utilities to make sure that we've got some streamlined permitting processes for things like distributed energy and building out the grid that's going to be necessary for that. So it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a while, and John's going to get into that here in a minute. So I look at this document. This is basically a how-to, things that we can do today, right? If our mission is emissions reductions, GHG reductions, what can we do today? So it's a great report. So without further ado, John, I'll pass it over to you, and I'm going to go dark, and I'll watch the Q&A come in.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Good morning for those of you in California. As Jeff said, we're going to walk through some of the findings in the report. What I want to start off before I turn over to Adam and talk about what they found when they wrote this for us, I want to talk about why. And Jeff alluded to it a little bit, but I wanted to give you a little more background as to what our thinking was when the board decided to commission this report and why we think it's such a critical element to our overall transportation dialogue. To Jeff's point, if we're serious about reducing emissions, we have to look at all opportunities to do so. And that's one of the major impetus behind this report. First of all, I always like to start off by sharing who is the Transportation Energy Institute. Those who've been around a while know us well as the Fuels Institute. We rebranded in May as a reflection of the evolution of the market, and the fact that some of our audiences viewed fuels as referring only to petroleum. When we started, that wasn't the way fuels was looked at, and we always looked at fuels as energy. But we decided, instead of fighting up a upstream battle, go ahead and just call us what we are. We've always been transportation energy, so just go ahead and change it from fuels to transportation energy. And so that's the deal behind the name change. This year's our current slate of board of advisors, and you see we have endeavored over the years to become the most inclusive and diverse group to ensure that our peer review process is capturing all perspectives and making sure that it's objective and unbiased. If you look here, you have everybody from major oil companies to electric vehicle equipment manufacturers to engine manufacturers, fuel marketers, you name it, American Lung Association, chemical companies. We really do run the gamut. And our board has been very specific. Expand the perspective, bring in different voices and different viewpoints to ensure that the research we're doing is as objective and as reliable as it can be. So as Jeff mentioned, our board reviews every single publication before we submit it to the public to ensure that it is fact-based and objective. And I guarantee you we have enough diversity of opinion that if there's something biased in here, somebody on the board is going to identify and call us out on it, and we'll fix it. So I'm really confident that the papers we're publishing, including this one, is a robust analysis and can be something that you guys can rely upon as a resource. We don't endeavor or suggest that we are answering every question or telling you what the silver bullet is. There is no silver bullet, but we believe strongly that the information we're publishing is something upon which you can rely to make more informed decisions. So let's get into the study a little bit. Decarbonizing combustion vehicles, a portfolio approach to GHG reductions. The bottom line is we commissioned this because, as Jeff said, electric vehicles are gaining market share. They're going to continue to do so. We can quibble and debate whether that should happen, should not happen, how fast that will happen, what needs to happen in order to facilitate that. But I think it's pretty clear they're going to gain market share. That being said, there are 300 million combustion vehicles in the United States. There's 1.5 billion combustion vehicles in the world, and they are emitting carbon today. So if we are concerned about climate change and we think we're facing a situation where we have to dramatically reduce our carbon emissions, and we don't do something about the existing fleet or the millions of combustion vehicles being sold every year for the foreseeable future, then we're really abdicating our responsibility. And we really think it's important that we can support the introduction of new technology, which offers a reduced emissions portfolio, while we identify solutions for the existing fleet and the continual sale of combustion vehicles throughout the world. And we have to remind ourselves that you've got Europe, Asia, and North America kind of looking heavily at the electrification trajectory. There are parts of the world that are not thinking about this at all because they're not in that position. They're going to be relying upon combustion liquid fuels for a long time. So any solutions we can come up with to help reduce carbon emissions today are going to have a very long benefit to the world and the environment as a whole. And so we have adopted at the Institute kind of a philosophy that we're focused on three things. We don't get involved in what should the transportation industry evolve into. That's for policymakers, that's for business leaders and other entities to decide. And they've already decided we have to decarbonize. Almost every single policy announcement you're seeing in the United States these days, North America and Europe, is we need to reduce carbon emissions. And so we recognize that. Our focus is, okay, you want to reduce carbon emissions, how do we do that? Most effectively, most efficiently, most sustainably. We also want to look at criteria air pollutants, because people breathe that today. That creates and presents an immediate threat to public health and the environment. And we can't ignore that because we're focused on decarbonization. And the final leg of that, it really underpins both of those objectives, is our solutions have to ensure that we're preserving access to affordable, reliable transportation for all communities. Within the United States, we have a huge disparity in what communities can afford, what they have access to. We have to make sure we leave nobody behind. Globally, same situation. So we want to make sure that we're exploring the most effective, cost-efficient, and long-lived, on a sustainable front, solutions that we can achieve. And that's one of the real things we're focused on in this report. Transportation is a top priority. Our politicians know that every constituent has some familiarity with a vehicle. They live among them, they see them every day, they know tailpipe emissions bad, right? Real easy message to deliver. Most constituents have not been around a power plant. They have not been around other emission sources. So it's really easy to focus on the topic and the area of the economy that is contributing to emissions with which your audience is familiar, and transportation's top of there. We also look at transportations, usually depending on the year and the analysis, around 30% to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And so it makes a lot of sense to focus on, and that's why we as the Transportation Energy Institute are laser focused on that side of the equation. That being said, electric vehicles present a huge opportunity. According to our life cycle analysis report we published 2 years ago, about 41% lower carbon emissions over the 200-mile life cycle of a vehicle in today's national electricity grid carbon intensity profile. It's not a silver bullet. They are not zero emissions. They help. They are a huge tool that we can use to achieve our decarbonization goals. But we have to remember, decarbonization does not equal electrification. There's too many use cases. There's too many vehicles in the market. There's too many scenarios where replacing the entire market isn't going to work. And even if we did, we're not getting to that net zero. And so we need to be opening up the toolbox, and we need to fill it with more resources. And that's what we're trying to do with this report, is fill up our options so we can find the best solutions for the right situations. Here's that life cycle report I mentioned. You do see a dramatic reduction over 200,000 mile design life of a vehicle, from 66 tons of greenhouse gas emissions for each combustion engine vehicle to 39% for each battery electric vehicle. But when I mentioned they're not zero emission, this points that out clearly. Nothing is zero emission. But we can look at where the emissions come from. We can make electric vehicles cleaner by cleaning up the grid. 72% of all life cycle emissions from the battery electric vehicle come from electricity generation. On the combustion engine vehicle, the focus of this report, 73% come from the vehicle operation while it's burning fuel. How do we address that? We look at the carbon intensity of the fuel, and how do we make changes to our fuel blends so that we can deliver carbon reduction potential to existing vehicles as well as new to market vehicles without having to swap out a whole bunch of technology, but just to bring that solution to market and really benefit the environment and consumers. Jeff mentioned the time it will take to turn over the fleet, and I think it's always important to put this in context. Through second quarter this year, battery electric vehicle growth was strong at 7% of all light-duty vehicle sales, on pace for more than 1 million units in this year. That being said, that is still significantly lower than the top 3 vehicles sold last year. The 3 big pickup trucks and the 3 major Detroit manufacturers, they sold 1.5 million. And so, yes, EVs are gaining traction, and the headlines are not wrong when they say, look at the growth, look at the opportunity electric vehicles show. But when you look at the actual data, we're still in the very early stages of this transition. And yet I'm still hearing more and more about the importance of carbon mitigation. We have to be serious on all fronts of carbon mitigation and not get lured into this idea that a solution in the future will solve the problems that we have identified today. We need solutions that work today, that work tomorrow, work 10 years, 20, 30 years down the road. And that means that toolbox needs to be full of those options. Politicians, however, like the idea that they found an answer, and they're trying to press that. They're saying, look, electric vehicles are the answer. That's easy. That's a message that resonates. It's a message that's easy to deliver on a stump speech and then sound bites. Consequently, you have countries throughout the world enacting bans on combustion engine sales at some date in the future. The most popular date is 2035. California has that. Canada has that. The European Union has adopted that. And so we're seeing this effort by leaders to force us into electric vehicles to address climate change, yet they're not really recognizing the life cycle impact of that. And even if they do, even if we were to get to a 2035 full transition of sales, it's going to take a very long time to replace the existing fleet. So when the European Union adopted their legislation, I went ahead and did a cocktail napkin math. Those of you who know who I am, I like doing kind of, used to call them back of the envelope calculations, these kind of unofficial, not scientifically rigorous discussion evaluations. But what would happen if this were to happen, right? And so I took a look and said, what if the US were to ban combustion sales by 2035 and mandate zero emission vehicle sales, however we want to define that? What would happen? Well, assuming we have a equivalent increase in ZEV sales to 2035 to get to 100% sales in 2035, and assuming 16.2 million vehicles sold a year, which was the average over the last 10 years, assuming a scrap rate of 5%, 2035, we would have 16.5% of vehicles in operation would be zero emission vehicle by that definition. Continue that 100% sales through 2050, 40% of vehicles on the road would still be combustion liquid fuel. Again, just evidence here that even in a very optimistic electric vehicle, zero emission vehicle transition scenario, we're going to be burning liquid fuels at least another 50 years. So how do we address that market? How do we have meaningful impact on our emissions reduction strategy? The latest proposal from the administration is to dramatically increase emissions reductions and fuel efficiency. And most estimates say it's going to require close to 70% of vehicles sold in 2032 to be electric, battery electric vehicles. So I did the math there. Same assumptions. If we get to 67% of vehicles in 2032 are battery electric vehicles, that's still only 9.8% of vehicles in operation. Again, you have 90% of vehicles in operation at that time are going to be combustion and have an engine and have fuel consumption. So we have to, I can't stress this enough, we cannot get stuck on one option. We need to open up the door of possibility. And so the report was structured in 4 ways. And then I'll turn it over to Adam here in a moment. Part 1 was prelude. We understand that there are some stakeholders who believe the solution's been found. It's a foregone conclusion. We're going pure electrification, and any discussion about combustion liquid fuels is just trying to derail us from that opportunity and that objective. So our prelude really looks at fleet turnover, looks at the value of early carbon mitigation reduction. It looks at what we need to do and where we are today. So really kind of set the stage, kind of what I just kind of presented here, and Adam will get a little more of that, about we have to talk about combustion while we're talking about new technologies. Then we asked them to look at life cycle analysis of options. What are the different energy options or different technology solutions that can benefit combustion vehicles, and what are the life cycle carbon emissions? Again, if we don't look at things beyond the tailpipe, if we don't look at well to wheels, we are not solving the problem. We're just shifting the problem to other sectors of the economy. So we really need to look at where is the carbon being emitted? How can we reduce those emissions anywhere possible to have the greatest impact on the environment? Then we want to look at a deep dive on biofuels. We know from experience and past reports that biofuels represent the most immediate opportunity we have to reduce carbon emissions and to reduce criteria pollutants in many markets. But there's a lot of question about, do we have enough feedstocks? Can we scale biofuel production? So we asked them to really dive deep. What is the ultimate potential of biofuels to satisfy our decarbonization objectives, and how do they fit in the market? And then the last stage really comes from my experience in the fuel retailing sector. You know, we started the Fuels Institute in 2013, TEI now, and I told people, you know, you may have the best solution on a vehicle technology, you may have the best solution on a fuel technology. If the ultimate consumer does not want your option, cannot access your option, or cannot afford your option, you failed. And so we wanted to know, we've studied the various options, we know their life cycle impact, we know what's going on with biofuels. Okay, Adam and team, how do we get those solutions into the vehicle? Because if we can't get into the vehicle, it's not a viable option. So the market transition section, part 4, really dives into all the challenges, opportunities, hurdles that need to be overcome for these solutions to have some level of viability in the market. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, you share yours, and you can walk us through the findings of the report.
All right, thank you, John, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Very happy to be representing the team at Stillwater Associates who worked on putting this report together. For those of you who are not familiar with Stillwater, we are a transportation fuel consultancy. Our clients include government agencies, oil and renewable fuel companies, trade associations, technology firms, private equity firms, and law firms. Our policy practice covers areas such as low carbon fuel programs, cap and trade, the U.S. Renewable Fuel Standard, and the fuel provisions of the IRA. In addition to custom reports and projects such as this, we publish newsletters on these topics and off-the-shelf credit price outlooks for the RFS and state low carbon fuel standards. So getting on to the subject of today's report, transportation is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. today. You know, slightly exceeding electric power over the 1990 to 2020 timeframe, as John mentioned. It changes a bit year to year, but that gives you the basic flavor. It's large, it's important. About 80% of that comes from road fuels, so gasoline, diesel, and their substitutes. So that's what we focus on in this report. That's the scope of what we're covering today. John talked about the time that's necessary to transition the fleet to electrics. How, many estimates are there and how long it'll take, but clearly it will be, no matter what you believe, it's not something that happens overnight. Meanwhile, the ICE vehicles, the internal combustion engine vehicles that are on the road today and which will be on the road for the next few decades will be emitting greenhouse gases, and those greenhouse gases will be in the air, in our atmosphere, far longer than those vehicles, which are already going to be in operation for so long into the future. So that's the imperative for taking action today if we want to meaningfully reduce greenhouse gas emissions and ward off the potential impacts of climate change. To give an assessment of the magnitude of the problem, annual emissions from road transport vehicles as modeled by Argonne Labs in 2021 are nearly 2 billion tons a year of CO2 and equivalents. And that doesn't change very much going all the way out to 2050, even as the fleet electrifies, as projected by regulations that were in place when this study was done. About 80% of those emissions come from light-duty vehicles, the cars and light trucks that you and I all drive in our daily lives. About 20% are the medium and heavy-duty sector. Looking at what examples of what we can do about that, first scenario I'll look at is the decarbonization of the diesel fleet, and that's about 20% of the road transportation mix. In this case study, which we worked up for one of our clients, we take a look at a hypothetical fleet of 10,000 medium and heavy duty diesel trucks in a major metropolitan area in the US. That's a very large fleet, obviously. Those trucks are in that type of service, think of package delivery and so forth in your town. Our high utilization, accumulate lots of miles every year. That fleet of 10,000 trucks, if it burns exclusively petroleum diesel, emits almost 800,000 tons per year of greenhouse gases. Overnight, since nearly all the newer trucks are rated for use of 20% biodiesel, switching them to B20 would reduce emissions by 15% or so to less than 700,000 tons. No need for infrastructure investment, no need for new vehicles. That's a change that can be done overnight. If alternatively, we could replace the fuel in those vehicles 100% with renewable diesel and biodiesel blends. Again, something that's compatible with vehicles that are already on the road and all the distribution equipment and infrastructure. That sounds crazy, but actually in California in the first quarter of this year, 49% of the diesel fuel has been displaced by renewable diesel and 8% by biodiesel. In real terms, that means about half of the diesel trucks on the road in California today are burning 100% renewable diesel. That's a silent story that doesn't get very far outside of us folks in the transportation fuels business, because that happened without new infrastructure, without new vehicles. It was pretty much a non-event as far as fleets are concerned. That's something that's realizable, and that's a trend that's continuing and growing, incentivized by California's low carbon fuel standard and similar programs in Oregon and Washington, and a steady growth in US supply of renewable diesel. Alternatively, those fleets can transition to electric vehicles, and many of them will. For the sake of this example, we assume that these vehicles are replaced each of them after a 5-year lifetime, which in this service is typical. those vehicles aren't scrapped after 5 years. As John indicated, they're on the road for a very long time, 20 or more years, but they go on to different services that are less demanding. So if we replace 20% of those vehicles each year with electrics, starting in 2026, arbitrarily, we get this stair step down. We have two lines here to illustrate that a key factor in the emissions benefits of electrification are what's the carbon intensity of the power that's being used to supply them. The upper line in this set is the US average power grid mix. The lower line, the more aggressive decarbonization is using California's power grid, which is less carbon intense as the US as a whole. And that gives you a range of what happens. So even after you transition 100% of that fleet, you still have more emissions than you would by just fueling your diesel vehicles with 100% renewable diesel, a change that has no extra cost to the fleet operator. And 80% of the emissions come from the light duty sector. And in this slide, we look at the total emissions of the light duty fleet in the US. For this work, we use the 2022 GREET model for determining emissions factors. And we use EIA's 2022 annual energy outlook as a baseline for the total US fuel demand going out to 2032 and beyond. The black line at the top of this chart is hypothetically if all of those light duty vehicles were fueled entirely with E10. We know that some of those vehicles today are fueled with EVs, and we'll get to that in a moment. But if they were fueled entirely with, if all that transportation was provided with E10, 10% ethanol blending gasoline, you get the top black line. That goes up from 21 to 2023 as the economy's recovered from COVID, and then starts going down. That decline is due to CAFE standards, which have been in place for many years, getting stricter or less strict with each change of administration in Washington, but a net effect of consistently driving the fuel economy of the US fleet more favorably. So the way to think about that is all the new cars that are bought this year as a whole have better fuel economy than the 15 or 20-year-old cars that are going to be scrapped this year. And as a result, fuel economy of the fleet overall improves. The red line on here is hypothetically, again, if starting in 2025, we replace all of that E10 with E15, a 15% ethanol blend, we can see the magnitude of the difference in emissions that simple substitution would provide. This is a hypothetical. Of course, not all the cars and gasoline-powered equipment in use is approved for use with E15, so this literally couldn't happen. But this illustrates the magnitude of the emissions benefit by the very simple change of swapping out E10 for E15, a change which the vast majority of vehicles currently on the road can do transparently with just addition of retail infrastructure. Finally, the yellow line brings in the effect of electrification using EIA, Department of Energy's forecast for electrification as of 2022, a small effect back in 2022 and growing a bit each year, so that's why the yellow line comes down faster than the black line. So that's the total mix of EVs and gasoline vehicles over time. So gives you a sense of the perspective of what electrification over the next decade contributes versus what E15 could contribute. This was done with the 2022 annual energy outlook. So that was done prior to passage of the Inflation Reduction Act last year. 2023 AEO does include came out after we did this work. It does include the impacts of the EV incentives that were included in the IRA. So an updated version of this chart would have the yellow line coming down a bit quicker, but the story would be the same. But our choices don't stop with the real world examples I've already provided. To look at the range of options out there, we look at the GREET model. GREET model, for those of you not familiar with it, is a life cycle model that's developed by Argonne Labs. It's updated every year, looking to predict the emissions impacts of a wide range of combinations of fuels, vehicle technology, different feedstocks, pathways, and so forth. It's updated annually, so it represents the most up-to-date compilation of data on the substance and a very rich database for folks interested in mining this further. The GREET model for 2021 and 2022 included 41 different pathways that produce lower emissions than gasoline. So when we look at the emissions, we talk about carbon intensity. And for gasoline, petroleum gasoline, that's estimated at 90 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. Megajoules are units of energy, similar to BTUs, but the metric version of that. So we use that instead of gallons in order for us to be able to compare different types of fuels that have different energy contents. A lower CI means lower emissions, and so is better. All of the options illustrated in this chart, each line is a different option, which you probably can't read or only with great difficulty, so reason to download the report. Offer significant benefits. This is corn ethanol, which is about the highest one on this chart at about 55, a substantial reduction from petroleum gasoline and comparable to here, the red, and we have all the different electricity options from different sources, hydrogen, electricity and hydrogen needing new vehicles in order to be commercialized as opposed to ethanol, different biodiesel options and renewable diesel options, which can use the vehicles that are already on the road. All in all, 24 different biofuel options included in the GREET model offer lower carbon emissions than electric vehicles powered by the US grid average, which is represented by this line here at 49 grams per megajoule. Another fuel we haven't talked about so far is renewable natural gas. Renewable natural gas is a drop-in fuel for natural gas vehicles. Natural gas vehicles are existing mature technology, readily available from multiple truck and engine manufacturers, all the major firms in the business, and widely used by fleets. They were widely adopted in about a decade or so ago as natural gas prices dropped relative to diesel prices, remain very reliable and low emitting fuels. The biggest hindrance to the growth in RNG, renewable natural gas as a fuel, is the limited scale of the natural gas vehicle fleet. However, another one of those silent victories is that nearly 100% of the natural gas vehicles in California and Oregon are currently fueled with renewable natural gas, and 84% of natural gas vehicles nationwide are fueled with renewable natural gas, offering huge emission benefits relative to other fuel options. But all those vehicles, or most of those vehicles, will rely on petroleum for many years ago. So it's important that we look at what can be done with the petroleum component of the fuels as well. In this chart, the left two bars represent the amount of energy that's used to produce gasoline and diesel fuel, respectively. The dark brown bar at the bottom is the amount used in producing crude oil. The medium brown is the refining process, and the amber at the top, which is most of the bar here, is what's emitted in combustion of the fuels. There's nothing we can do in the production of petroleum fuels that change that amber bar. And that's why we focus on biofuels as a very valuable option. But there are important things that can be done in the refining and the oil and gas production process. In addition to these, I should have mentioned, in addition to these bars, which are the energy required, these right-hand bars are the greenhouse gas emissions related to the use of that energy. In oil and gas production, there's significant use of thermal energy, largely steam and electricity, to operate the wells, lift the oil out of the ground and transport it to market by pipeline. Much of that energy could, in principle, be provided by renewable natural gas and renewable power. In fact, in California, that is something that many crude producers do in order to capture low carbon fuel standard credits. Additionally, a major source of emissions is flaring and fugitive emissions, particularly in methane, and that's been an intense area for debate and development at both the federal and state regulatory levels. Within the refinery, energy is probably the third biggest cost for running a refinery after procurement of crude and paying for the staff. And so for the 150 odd years of the refining industry, that's been an area where the industry has steadily improved the energy efficiencies of all of their processes on an economic basis. And each year it gets better and better. Some of that energy in principle could be provided by renewable power and renewable natural gas if there was an incentive to do that. In California, there is a bit of that from the low carbon fuel standard, but that's not anything in federal policy to incentivize that. Within the refining process, there are two particular places, the catalytic cracking units and the hydrogen plants, where there are concentrated CO2 streams, which are amenable for carbon capture. Implementing carbon capture at those 2 points in the refinery could reduce the refining contribution to gasoline emissions by 15% and 30% for diesel. That's why we see folks like Exxon looking at projects on the Gulf Coast to capture CO2 emissions from refining and chemical plants. And 45Q enhancements contained in the IRA, depending on how they wind up being implemented, may be a major incentive for having that happen. The other big issue, of course, is getting permits for pipelines and getting permits for injection wells that are needed to implement carbon capture. Moving to biofuels, there's two areas that we look at. One is feedstock production, and the other is the conversion of the feedstocks into fuels. On the feedstock production side, leading contributors to greenhouse gas emissions are the diesel fuel used in the farm equipment. So that, of course, could be replaced with renewable diesel or biodiesel, and use of nitrogen-based fertilizers. That's an area where the seed companies have been steadily working to produce seeds that require less fertilizer to develop, and that's been tremendous progress on that front, as well as development of more precise fertilizing methodologies for farmers to reduce the amount of nitrogen needed in order, particularly for growing corn. On the manufacturing side of biofuels, most of the emissions actually come from the natural gas and electricity used to power the plant. For corn ethanol production, about a third of the natural gas is used to dry the wet distiller's grains, the high protein concentrate recovered from the fermentation process to dry distiller's grain, which is needed when that drying process is needed in order to make the product stable for long distance shipment. But many plants that are located near feedlots, sell the product wet in order to save that energy. And those are the plants largely that are supplying the West Coast states that have low carbon fuel programs. Additionally, low carbon fuel standard provides incentives for renewable natural gas and electricity use in the plants. And lastly, carbon capture, similar to refining, the ethanol fermentation makes a large, high concentration CO2 stream that's ideal for capture and storage. 45Q, depending on how that gets implemented, is an important incentive. But again, as we just look in the news today, permitting for right-of-ways and in the future, permitting for injection wells will be a big issue. Ethanol producers have made tremendous strides in technologies and implementing reduced emissions in order to supply the West Coast markets with a low carbon fuel standard. However, corn ethanol is the only fuel in the RFS that's categorically barred from ever being an advanced biofuel. So for the 80% or so of ethanol that's not supplied to the West Coast, there's no incentive currently in place to drive the adoption of more carbon efficient technologies. We can't talk about biofuels, of course, without talking about feedstocks. USDA and US Department of Energy has done several reports over the years assessing availability of feedstocks and assessing there's a huge volume of which we're only using a fraction currently. The amount that we can produce improves steadily each year as yields of corn and soybeans improves every year. In fact, U.S. crop acreage has gone down since the implementation of the RFS because of improving yields of these key crops. Meanwhile, U.S. exports of soybeans has doubled, and exports of wheat and corn, the other major exports, have stayed largely stable. Another hidden silent victory in the renewable fuel space is that actually only about 40% of biodiesel and renewable diesel is produced from soybean oil. The majority of it's produced from waste feedstocks such as inedible tallow, used cooking oil, and distillers corn oil. And that's been an area that's been growing tremendously, incentivized again by low carbon fuel standards. Additional areas of growth are cover crops, which contribute to soil health and provide potential feedstocks. Developing those and developing the crushing infrastructure necessary to recover the oils from those requires policies that are long-term and stable in order that investment will be made to make that happen. To start bringing this to a close, the bad news is there is no silver bullet that we can put forth to solve the issue of decarbonizing internal combustion engines. The good news, of course, is there are lots of good options, all of which used collectively can get us there. In this table, we highlight things that are currently available for use in internal combustion engines, things that are available for alternative fuel vehicles. I talked a bit about renewable natural gas, limited only by the size of the natural gas vehicle fleet. E85 is an old story, but in California is actually one that's seen steady growth. Another silent victory for renewable fuels. Long-term growth there is challenged, however, by the phasing out of federal incentives for the OEMs to produce the flex fuel vehicles needed to use E85. And so that will be a challenge for us to maintain that progress going forward. Additionally, we have many fuel options that require technology development that's there. We have the feedstocks available. We have ideas for the technology, but for the investments to be made to bring that into reality, it requires long-term, stable federal state policies that will incentivize that to happen. As a summary of what you get, and if you download the report for free, as John mentioned, is a summary of the various attributes of all the different fuel combinations that we review, and this table goes on far longer than what I've shown on the screen. We just blew up this segment so you can actually read it on your computer screens today. We compare all the key issues regarding the feasibility of all these fuels and what it would take to get us there. And to summarize, we have fuels that are available today that work in vehicles and infrastructure that is there today. We have fuels with near-term potential, waiting yearly on supportive policies to ensure that it makes sense for people to invest their capital and their energy in order to bring those to market. And lastly, there's an even richer set of options that requires more technology development and investment. Again, that only happens with long-term stable government policies. So to wrap up, we've talked about how critical decarbonizing ISEVs is in order to address the challenge of climate change in any kind of meaningful way in the US as well as the rest of the world. We've talked about a few of the many options that are there. The key message is those options are there. There are quite a few of them. Biofuels are and will continue to be the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest ones for us to implement in the current vehicles and using current infrastructure that's relatively easy to change. But making that happen requires consistent long-term policies. And with that, I'll turn things back over to John, and I believe it's time for Q&A.
I've got just one more slide I want to share for you guys. I took the big chart that Adam was talking about, kind of summarized it for myself and used it in a couple articles I've written. If we start looking at these options that are detailed in the study, the pros, cons, the opportunities and hurdles are all evaluated for each of these options for combustion vehicles, we start seeing the range of potential CO2 equivalent reduction from each. And there may be some out there go, well, look, this isn't 100%. We need a 100% solution. And there are very few 100% solutions in the world. But if we start layering options, for example, if you were to make efforts to reduce the carbon emissions from the oil fields and the petroleum refinery, reduce carbon emissions from agricultural processes and biorefineries, and combine those, you're looking at not 2%, 3%, you're looking at possibly 25, 30% carbon reduction with the same end product going into the distribution system, the fueling station, and the vehicle. So we have opportunities to start cutting carbon out of the market without changing anything, which I think is a huge opportunity that we need to explore. And then we start looking at longer term opportunities with maybe higher blends of biofuels as vehicles become compatible, or moving into other technologies of production, pyrolysis, or using new fuels like e-fuel or even hydrogen and ice. These start offering even higher degrees on a longer term basis of carbon equivalent reduction. So I put this together because I like pictures. I love tables too. I love spreadsheets, all that stuff. But sometimes putting it graphically shows you how different technologies can combine. Now, if you were to reduce the carbon intensity of the liquid fuel by, say, 30%, and that gasoline and diesel blend doesn't change, but everything before it is lower carbon, and you combine it with a high efficiency combustion vehicle or high efficiency combustion hybrid vehicle, you now compounding your carbon reduction potential now and for the next 20-year life of that vehicle. And so that's the context I want to leave with before I turn back over to Jeff for Q&As. There's no silver bullet. It's going to take a number of different options that maybe combine to really deliver some meaningful carbon mitigation now and in the coming years, which is going to pay dividends down the road so much more than just waiting and saying, well, that's not good enough. At some point, better has to be acceptable and encouraged, because better yields even better and ultimately best. We can't sit back and wait for the 100% solution to replace everything in the world, because we have the ability and the tools to make difference now. And so I thought this chart was a good kind of pictorial reference of the fascinating tables they put together for us that I wanted to share with you. And Jeff, I'll give it back to you for any questions that might be pending.
All right. And you started to get into one of the questions, John, from Kelly Swanson. I think it was Kelly Swanson. And you know, one of the things that Adam, Adam jumped into, and with this paper we talked about LCFS, RFS, and the schemas, right? The regulatory schemas that we're working under. And I will add just a little bit of color to that. the TEI board asked us to put together a working group to map out things like sustainable agriculture and start looking at what we can do really literally at ground level when we're talking about creating potential ultra low carbon biofuels that eventually are going to get put into the mix. And so we've been working on that for about a month now, our working group. And so then the question is why? Why are we doing that? There is no federal low carbon fuel standard right now. And without it, there's really no stick there, or there's no carrot. So we've been really focusing on what's coming out of industry requests, industry demands between industry partners on reporting Scope 1 emissions between industry partners, and how are we going to do that on a tailpipe and a life cycle basis, which I think is absolutely necessary. So creating a standard practice and methodology, it's verifiable, in that regards, when it comes to Scope 1 emissions. Amazon made the announcement. Other large publicly traded companies are making the announcement. If you want to do business with us, you will tell us what your Scope 1 emissions are in order to continue doing business with us. And if they look good, then you're going to get preferred business from us. And so that writing's on the wall. I mean, we're seeing those announcements every day. So there is a stick and a carrot out there, even though we don't have a federal low carbon fuel standard. So we are trudging forward, looking at all of these variables so that industry has the tools that they need. And that's my long way of moving into the question I'm going to pass over to John, because John was originally in the Co-Optima group when we were talking about it, and you started to touch on it already in what you were saying, John. So the question was, have we considered the carbon intensity / fuel combos identified by the researchers involved with Co-Optima? And I think maybe, John, the group might want a little bit of background on Co-Optima first, because it's come, it's gone, it's come, it's gone. But I'm going to pass that one over to you.
So I was fortunate to serve on the external advisory board of the Co-Optima project, almost from its inception. Ruben Sarkar kind of kicked it off, and followed that work. A lot of it was so far over my head. I mean, these were some smart cookies working on this, and I kept having to lean over to our chairman, David Foster, from the University of Wisconsin. But dude, I don't understand. What are they talking about? But what they were looking at is, how do you achieve a certain carbon emission reduction, largely through optimized fuel and spark ignition engines, looking at high compression ratio engines, high octane fuels, and how you get there. Then moved into more mixed compression ignition engines and all that. But when we were looking at it, they identified a slate of fuel components that could contribute to higher octane, lower CI, higher performance in a spark ignition engine. And some of those, I'm sure, are incorporated in some of this. A lot of those were just chemicals that had not really found a whole lot of market ability. And halfway through the Co-Optima project, the project was shifted to not look at market transition, market scalability components, and just look at the chemical components itself. And so I think Co-Optima was kind of hamstrung towards the end in terms of the benefit it can deliver to the market as a whole. But I think there was a lot of material in there that is parallel to what we're trying to do. I think I'll ask Adam if kind of how they selected what they were looking. I know they were looking primarily at what the GREET results were rather than looking at the co-optima. I've spoken to some people in the fuel production sector that co-optima was a nice contribution, but because we didn't get into how can you actually bring it to market, there was a kind of and now what do we do with this information, which was disappointing after the 6 or 7 years we spent working on it. Adam, did you guys have any thought process on the co-optima results at all?
So yes, thank you, John. We didn't look directly at it. We're aware of it. We did try to focus on fuels where we had life cycle data. Developing new life cycle data was outside the scope of our project, so we relied a lot on the fuels that were pathways that were in the GREET model, which are informed by co-optima where applicable. And then with a bit of a filter on what are the things that we felt had a reasonable possibility of being commercialized in the near term. So we thought about, what's the manufacturability of fuels and volume and issues like that.
Okay. Moving on, we've got about 4 minutes left, so I'm gonna touch on a couple of these things pretty quickly. Yes, we will have the slides available. Prentice had a good question on the assumptions of hydrogen manufacturing, the carbon intensity of hydrogen, as far as what is the assumption for how that hydrogen is manufactured. That's kind of a long answer, I'm assuming. But so Adam, before you jump into that one, I wanted to really touch on Massimo's question here, just in the sense that we do have other research in the works, and that includes hydrogen, that includes e-fuels. So these are all things that TEI is currently working on, and you're going to see more of this research from us in the coming 12 plus months. So stay in touch. And we can talk more about your question as well, or reach out to us, and we can talk about what our agenda is at the Institute and where we're going with that. So, Adam, I want to get back to Prentice's question, if you're okay with that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Bouncing around here. So I was on the last slide. It shows hydrogen being 40 to 100% renewable. What do you mean by that?
Okay, and I believe that's John's slide. That that was and I think that was in the context of hydrogen ICE vehicles. So there are a variety of pathways, and that for producing hydrogen, ranging from fossil natural gas and a steam methane reformer to electrolysis of seawater with renewable energy, which actually gives you a wide scope of emissions potentially with hydrogen, and that the range of the renewable hydrogen options are what's I believe is reflected in John's slide there.
Yeah, so I mean, this comes from, we have the two tables in the report, table 16 and 17 on pages 176, 177, where Stillwater summarized the challenges and the opportunities. And in there is where I pulled the 60 to 100% potential carbon reduction. And yeah, it really comes down to what is the format of hydrogen production. Clearly, there's a lot of discussion on colors, gray, blue, green. So really depending on where you derive your hydrogen from will influence the overall carbon reduction potential of using hydrogen as a fuel.
And again, you'll be seeing more from TEI on that topic. I think we're going to be jumping into that with both feet here soon. We just received all of our bids on the e-fuels discussion, which is very fascinating when you talk about decarbonizing the existing ICE fleet, right? Not here today, extremely expensive, but it's kind of that unicorn that's hanging around out there. All right, folks, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And again, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Or if you think of a question later on and you have an aha moment, shoot it over to us, and we will certainly engage. More than happy to.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.